Okay, we're back with part 2 of CSS, where we're going to read some CSS and learn about how it works before we attempt to start diving in and writing some CSS. I have on my desktop here a CSS example, which is some code that's what you're going to get in class, and I'm just going to go ahead and open this up by dragging it over into Atom here, and go ahead and open that up. And it's going to open up, and this should look familiar-ish to you from doing your HTML work, but it's going to open up over here, and you notice that I've got a folder with an image in it. This little DS store, you can ignore it, it's an invisible file that's just used by GitHub. And then I've got 4 actual pages in here, 4 actual files in here. I've got an index.html page, a style.css page, a finish.html page, and a finish.css page. Throughout the semester, most of the time when you guys get code examples from me and from Elizabeth, what's going to happen is that you'll have a starting and a finished version of it so that you can sort of keep yourself from being confused, and you can have the answer, as it were, from the start. So that's the case here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to work through this example here in a bit and in a little bit later of this series of videos. But let's start just by reading the finished CSS style sheet to start with and see if we can figure out what's going on with the style sheet. So when I click on this to open it up, what I can see is that I've got a finished CSS style sheet open in this tab, and then I've got some styles going on down the page. I've got about 65 lines of code in here, which is pretty typical for a starting out style sheet, but let's just take a look at this and we can reference the HTML sheet and see if we can read it and figure out what's going on. So the very first thing at the top that I see is this little comment that says styles go here, and so I can see that this is commented out for a couple of reasons. One is that whenever you comment something out, Atom will, for you, automatically make it italic or oblique, I guess in this case, and make it gray and kind of tell you that that's going on here. And I can see that that's a comment because of the way that that's all working here. So styles go here, so that's good to know. This is where I'm writing my style sheet. And then I've got a paragraph here that is commented out, and this paragraph command would have been to take the paragraphs and make the color of the paragraphs red. I don't really want to do that for body text. That's not a real pleasant reading experience, so I'm going to assume that the instructor probably just put this here to be able to demonstrate something about the styles, which is the case. That's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do here. So the paragraph color red is there. And then here, starting on line 7, I get to some actual style that I can see what's going on, and it's going to change some things that are on the page. So taking a look at what's happening here, I see that I've got a p tag, and then Atom will tell me, because it balances out, or it underlines where these are balanced out, what is actually going on inside of this paragraph declaration here. I can also tell that this is going to affect every paragraph on the page, because it's just a p tag here. It doesn't have anything else next to it. There's no period, there's no hashtag or pound sign next to it. So I know that this is just an element tag, it's not a class or an ID. And then diving on a little bit deeper in here, I can see that there's a color here, and it's a hex color that's 666666. So we'll see what that color actually is when we go over to our HTML page and look at it here. And then I've also got a font family here, which is Helvetica, Arial, and Sans Serif. So something that we didn't talk about in the lecture here is the font family command. And you can probably make a guess at what the font family command does. It tells the browser what font family it should use. And so you see names of common fonts. You probably have heard of these, even if you're not, if you haven't previously done a lot of designing or if you weren't a typographer. But Helvetica, Arial, and Sans Serif are all types of fonts. Now, the question that we get into then is, why are there 3 of these things here, and what's that doing for us? And the answer is, not all fonts are the same on everybody's computer. Helvetica is pretty safe if you've got a Mac. Any version of a Mac going back to the early days of Macs, back to the Mac Plus, actually had Helvetica installed. But most PCs don't. Most PCs that are running Windows don't have access to that. And the system font equivalent to Helvetica over in the PC world is Arial. So what this is going to tell the browser to do is, hey, style this in Helvetica, if that's available. If not, go ahead and style it in Arial. And then let's pretend that our hypothetical user who's going to be reading this page in their browser has maybe a home-built machine, maybe they're using Linux, maybe they're using something where they have a limited number of fonts installed, or they have an adaptive computer that has a very specific sans serif font installed or whatever else. It's just going to tell the browser to default to the basic sans serif. So that's kind of cool. We're 10 lines in, and we have already read about, we are starting to figure out some stuff. This is commented out, so the paragraph isn't going to be red. This is not, so the paragraph's going to be whatever this mysterious color is and have these fonts on it. So that's pretty cool. Now, the H1. is going to have a font family command as well, and the font family here is going to be Georgia as the first option, Times New Roman, we'll talk about why this is in quotes in just a second, and then a generic serif font. So if you know anything about these fonts, you know that Georgia and Times New Roman are both serif fonts, and if the browser doesn't have either of those, then it's going to default to using just a plain old serif generic font. Pretty straightforward. We can read this because we just read what was up here. So let's talk for a second about Times New Roman here. Because this is the name of a font that has spaces in it, what we need to do is we need to tell the browser that this is an entire string value here. So we do that by putting quotes around the words that have spaces around them. You can use single or double quotes, it doesn't really matter. I use double quotes out of force of habit. Either one will work. And this drives journalism students up a tree, but I promise you this is the way it's supposed to work. The comma needs to go outside of the quote marks. The comma isn't part of the name of the font, right? The comma is there to tell the browser that we have multiple options here in this font family. So it has to go outside of the quote marks that we have here. And then moving down a little bit, we can see that we have something that's got an ID of container. And this is where it's useful to pop over into our HTML page and start looking at it to see what we can read as far as what this is going to apply to. So let's open up the finished HTML page. And what we can see is that this is pretty straightforward. We've seen all this stuff before. We have our document type up here. We have our HTML tag here. We have our head, which opens on line 6 and closes on line 14. And then here in the body, we can start looking for stuff that looks like this. Now remember, what we saw on the other side in our finished style sheet is that we had something with an ID of container. And we know that because this says container, and it has a pound sign right at the start of it. So we know what's going on there. And over here then what we see is we see an ID that equals container. So whatever this container div contains is what's going to be affected by any styling that goes on here. So we see the div starts up here, and then we see it doesn't get balanced. We don't have that little underline under it until we get all the way to the bottom of the page on line 49 here. And we also have a little piece of content here that says that we are ending the container div. This little comment tells us that the container div is ending there. So what I know is that this is going to, any style that I put in here is going to affect everything from line 18 of my code all the way down to right before the body ends on line 49 of my code. So this is a pretty big tag for me here. And then we'll talk through what this is going to be, and then we'll pause and start with the nav in the next video. So the container tag here, the container ID, is being used once on the page, and what we're using it for actually is to be able to contain the content to a certain width and a certain margin. And the width of 95% tells us that whatever the container is going to be 95%, and of what you ask, it's going to be 95% of its containing element. And in this case, the containing element is the body tag. So whatever the width of the body is, the container is going to be 95% of that width. And it's also going to be centered in here because we see a margin tag, and the shorthand for this we'll talk through when we talk through the shorthand when we start writing it. But the basic idea is that there's going to be 0 margin on the top and bottom, and automatic margin on the left and right. So in other words, what this tells the browser to do is to take this whole container, which is again everything on the page that's inside the body tag, give it a width of 95% of whatever the body tag is, and then set the margin automatically on the right and left sides of the page. So the other 5% of the width will be distributed on either side of that. So as we make the page bigger and smaller, the content within it will also become bigger and smaller. All right, I'm going to pause there on line 19 because it's time to fire up a browser and actually look at this in the browser as we compare the code to one or another piece of itself here.